Hello everyone and welcome back to SFF180. Thomas here, your host. As always, now this week we have a crossover between Top 5 Wednesday and the BookTube SFF Babbles on the subject of our favorite examples of SFF from media other than books. Now, I've always been very strict about sticking to my rule of keeping SFF180 focused on science fiction and fantasy reading. Now, there are already an endless number of movie and video game channels, and while even a poorly viewed video on those subjects would no doubt exceed the views on my most popular videos, I've still always preferred to serve an underserved YouTube demographic, fans of SFF reading. But of course, there's always crossover, and since I've been given permission to go a little bit astray for once, I thought I'd choose 5 examples of SFF for movies, TV, and games that I especially like. It's definitely not an exhaustive list of all of my all-time life favorites, but they are ones that I have derived a lot of enjoyment from. It would be easy to rattle off the usual suspects here, but I'm going to refrain from discussing Star Wars, Star Trek, Blade Runner, all the super popular franchises and series that have been already discussed and argued to death by probably every living human on the internet. I mean, it's not that those works haven't impacted me. I mean, Jesus, I'm a first-generation Star Wars convert, people. But seriously, for God's sake, what could I possibly add that wouldn't bore both you and me? My choices for this top 5 are a ways off the beaten path, but I think all of them are works that have done interesting and sometimes profoundly influential things within the genre. A few of them are wildly controversial, with both avid champions and detractors. One of them is an obscurity, a particular personal favorite that most of you, I believe, will have never heard of. So, this could be fun. Let's step away from the bookshelves for a moment and fire up some electronic devices and see what else there is to talk about. Now, while I probably wouldn't fit anyone's definition of a hardcore gamer, I love the medium, and I generally tend to focus on a smaller number of games that I can immerse myself in fully. I'm not one of those guys with 4,000 titles in my Steam collection. I tend to prefer open-world sandbox games that I can invest 300 hours in, rather than a large library of short games that I can power through in 1 or 2 sittings. I like story-driven games, mostly, meaning that all my online friends who are shooting each other to pieces right now in PUBG are doing it without me. I'm currently into Far Cry Primal. There are several SFF game franchises that I follow devoutly. Fallout, Assassin's Creed, Elder Scrolls, Dragon Age, Mass Effect, except for that last one. But here, I am giving some love to... yes, Destiny. It's a narrative game that also presents the co-op experience in a way that I don't find annoying. Now, for those of you who don't game at all, the story is simple enough. We're 700 years in the future, and the remnants of humanity on Earth are living in a single city, under the protection of the Traveler, a giant globe of celestial origin that has bestowed the power of light on 3 classes of warriors called Guardians. Now, you guessed it. You play a Guardian, dashing through the solar system, shooting, burning, hammering, slicing, blasting, electrocuting, and otherwise inconveniencing the various swarms of aliens and nasty robots determined to kill us, or enslave us, or do whatever they do. A lot of things were impressive about Destiny, in particular, the way the developers allowed the game 2 years to breathe, rather than rushing half a dozen sequels and spin-offs into immediate development. Weaknesses in the game that drew a lot of criticism upon its initial release in 2014 were actually addressed, and improved upon in later expansions and updates, to the point where the game was so improved, upon the release of its final expansion Rise of Iron, that it was easy to imagine there never needed to be a sequel, just continued expansions of the core game. Ease of playability was also marvelous. I can't think of all the games I've sat down with where I just couldn't work out what the hell the developers were thinking of with an overcomplicated control scheme. Destiny was just a game anyone could sit down and play. And frankly, its visuals were, and still are, glorious. A specific touch that the classic SF reader in me always liked was the way the story unabashedly followed the template of old-school planetary romance in the look of different worlds. So we've got Jungles on Venus, and deep caverns on the Moon, and dead trees among the sands of Mars, and a giant semi-organic alien dreadnought that's punched a big hole in Saturn's rings just so it can park there. We also get Nathan Fillion snarking it up as one of the mentors to your Guardian.
Zavala, this is my serious face. Can't you tell?
So, this game did what I would love a science fiction game to do. It put me in an imaginative future, and gave me endlessly replayable opportunities to run, and jump over things, and shoot bad guys, and dress my character in sexy armor. But I can't say I have quite the same enthusiasm for Destiny 2, last year's sequel. I mean, sure, the playability is still there, but the new game made some changes in the in-game economy no one seems to like, unwisely pushed microtransactions to the forefront, and most disappointingly didn't really innovate the experience, feeling more like a retread than a real evolution of the concept. Little scandals didn't help, like the discovery the game was throttling back experience points, nor the developers' general disinterest in responding to concerns raised by the community. You'd like sequels to at least take a stab at being next level, but Destiny 2 has taken way too long, making even the kinds of fundamental quality of life improvements that made fans of the first game happy to log on every single day. Still, I'm not here to grouse about what I didn't like, although being a critic, I guess I can't hold back on that altogether. So, whatever shortcomings it has now, I consider the original Destiny an enormously satisfying SFF experience.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Like it or not, 2001: A Space Odyssey is an exercise in pure cinema with a bold, expansive story that frankly isn't really that difficult to figure out, my god. Formally groundbreaking, it pioneered a number of filmmaking techniques, and it revolutionized the field of visual effects so profoundly that 50 years later, all of its entirely analog in-camera effects remain more convincing than the vast majority of present-day CGI. For instance, how many of you knew that the entire opening Dawn of Man sequence was shot on a soundstage in England, and not, in fact, on location in the wilds of Africa? 2001 was the shared brainchild of Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, one of those filmmakers you learn to revere in film school. Now, the two of them wanted to make a prestige science fiction movie at a time when, outside of the genre's immediate fandom, science fiction was scorned as the sort of thing geared towards pubescent boys not yet grown up enough to discover girls and/or drugs. Kubrick's technical perfectionism and Clarke's hard SF creative proclivities probably seemed like a match made in slide rule heaven, but even Clarke wasn't expecting how uniquely Kubrick would choose to interpret his material. The movie is a lot like an extended tone poem, relying largely on the intercutting of visuals and music, much less on old-fashioned concepts like story and character, but still allowing for narrative tension and an eye-popping sense of wonder in telling its story of humanity's contact with an alien higher power. I find very few things in life more entertaining than just how intensely the literary science fiction community detested this movie. Although, being released in 1968, it was a smash hit among hippies, for whom the final act Stargate sequence made for a transcendent acid trip experience. Arthur C. Clarke reportedly fled the theater in tears at the premiere screening. Rock Hudson famously stormed out in a huff, demanding to know what the hell it was all supposed to be about. And hard science fiction writers in particular felt almost personally attacked by the film's portrayal of First Contact as some kind of quasi-religious experience, the unseen aliens more like benevolent New Age gods than extraterrestrials. Lester Del Rey, who had written a story in which God sends alien invaders to wipe us out, and humanity responds by figuring out how to blow up God with a nuke, was especially salty. But when you look at the amazing restoration trailer put together by the BFI 3 years ago, it's easy to grasp the compelling narrative and sense of conflict that has made the movie one of the most acclaimed classics of all time. Now, beyond the space mysticism, it's the story of humanity being overtaken by our own technology, as two astronauts on a voyage to Jupiter find themselves at the mercy of their own ship's AI, the infamous HAL. Now, apparently it was coincidental that HAL's name was one letter away in its spelling from IBM. Kubrick's detractors call him a cold filmmaker, and 2001 is often criticized for lacking a single sympathetic character. I'd suggest this was a deliberate creative strategy. By remaining aloof from his boring parade of NASA dudes, we find ourselves invested in Hal, a villain who has all the human relatability that the Discovery crew lacks. Hal may well be the archetype for the evil AI trope, and I guess he can seem especially creepy to anyone who's freaking out because their Alexa has started laughing at them. But in fact, Hal isn't evil. Hal is simply doing exactly what he's been programmed to do, and using his reasoning faculties to carry out his mission profile in the most appropriate way. After all, none of his programmers ever said he shouldn't murder his crew to protect the safety and integrity of the mission. I'll be the first person to tell you that if you've never seen 2001, it needs something of a presentation to be properly appreciated, and it's definitely not something you should watch on your phone, or for that matter, even your laptop. If you've got access to a nice big LED screen, then try going into it with as few preconceptions as possible, and with the firm knowledge that what you're getting into is not standard commercial cinema, and very much the kind of movie people used to stay up all night arguing about. Now, I've been lucky enough to see it in a theater setting a few times, and now, well, I'm just waiting for the 4K release, scheduled for May.
Зона — это очень сложная система ловушек, что ли. Но стоит тут появиться людям, как все здесь приходит в движение.
On to another classic, and this is one you probably won't know, unless the words Criterion Collection give you an instant cinema stiffy. Andrei Tarkovsky was a Soviet filmmaker who became a world-renowned talent despite making only 7 films. Interestingly, for a critical darling and artistic icon who worked primarily in the 70s and 80s, 2 of those 7 films were science fiction, 1 was speculative fiction, and 1 is a kind of magical realism visual poem that's like watching an actual dream unspool on screen. His most famous movie was Solaris, an adaptation of the Stanislaw Lem novel about an astronaut on a space station orbiting a telepathic planet. But I personally lean towards Stalker, a philosophical story very loosely based on another SF novel, Roadside Picnic, by the Russian brothers Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. In the story, the Stalker is a professional guide who leads 2 men, a writer and a professor, into a forbidden, cordoned-off area of wilderness called the Zone, where natural laws don't seem to apply, and which might even be self-aware. Deep within the Zone is said to be a room which grants anyone who enters it their fondest wish, though this is more likely to be an unconscious wish than a conscious one. Now, in the book, the Zone is explicitly described as resulting from alien visitation, but Tarkovsky keeps the origins mysterious in order to concentrate on his own philosophical interests. And so the central theme of the movie involves humanity's desperate pursuit for happiness and the trauma that can result when happiness is forever elusive.
Пусть исполнится то, что задумано. Пусть они поверят. И пусть посмеются над своими страстями. Ведь то, что они называют страстью, на самом деле не душевная энергия, а лишь трение между душой и внешним миром. А главное, пусть поверят в себя и станут беспомощными, как дети. Потому что слабость велика, а сила ничтожна.
So, if you are a fan of Tarkovsky, then you love him for the reasons he is explicitly uncommercial. His movies are long and quiet and move slowly. He favors long takes, sometimes running several minutes, in which not a lot of action seems to happen within the frame. But for those of you who don't need endless bombast to hold your attention, his movies have a hypnotic, even apocalyptic beauty that is far better experienced than described. I mentioned when I reviewed the novel of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation that the book felt powerfully influenced by Stalker, and the recent movie of Annihilation also shows strong signs of its influence, although Annihilation is more explicitly fantastical. As for Stalker, it was an incredibly difficult production. Tarkovsky had to reshoot the movie a total of 3 times, because the Soviet labs weren't advanced enough to process the film stock properly. And because some of the locations were literally toxic, being located near a chemical plant that was just dumping its waste wherever, the movie can be reliably charged with killing its director, his wife, and one of his actors, all of whom would die from the same kind of cancer only a few years later. But the movie left behind is a real jewel of art house SF, and a restored version can be seen on Blu-ray or streamed in the US on Filmstruck.
Who are they running from? What have they seen? Whom do they fear? There are 5 million answers to these questions, and every one of them is a shocker.
If you don't love Hammer films, GTFO. Everything about this venerable, low-budget British studio was great, even when they were at their cheesiest. But when they were good, they were very, very good indeed. And besides, any studio that consistently gave employment to Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, plus allowed Oliver Reed to work no matter how drunk he was doing the Lord's work. One of my favorite of the old Hammers is not actually any of their 11 billion Dracula or Frankenstein offerings. It was this little late 60s science fiction gem. Quatermass and the Pit was the creation of famed movie and TV writer Nigel Kneale, who worked prolifically for the BBC throughout the 50s and 60s, including a live TV adaptation of 1984 that ended up being one of the most controversial broadcasts of its time. The Quatermass backstory is kind of interesting. Kneale created the character of the heroic scientist Professor Bernard Quatermass in 1953, and the character appeared in several TV productions which were later remade as theatrical movies by Hammer. The first actor to play the character for Hammer Films was an American named Brian Donlevy. But Donlevy was a fading veteran of film noir, where he played a lot of heavies. And he was all wrong for the character of Quatermass, playing him like a pissed-off cop, blustering around barking orders at everyone. Nigel Kneale, who could throw enough shade to cause an eclipse, had this to say. Donlevy was really on the skids and didn't care about what he was doing. He took very little interest in the making of the films or in playing the part. It was a case of take the money and run. Or in the case of Mr. Donlevy, waddle. Quatermass and the Pit was the 3rd Hammer film in the series, and it had the classiest production and best cast of just about any of their movies so far. Kneale himself was even a fan. This time, Professor Quatermass was played by stoic yet sensitive Andrew Keir, an actor who, in the alternate universe of my dreams, went on to play Gandalf and Dumbledore.
You've been busy hinting at Mars. Mars is dead. Nothing there but a few scraps of lichen. 5 million years ago, it may have been very different. Suppose at that time there were living beings on it, with techniques that enabled them to visit the Earth at a time when the most highly evolved creatures here, our own ancestors, were only a type of Pliocene ape.
The story begins when a crew excavating a disused London tube station uncovers something initially believed to be an unexploded bomb from way back in the Blitz. Soon enough, we learn that's no bomb, it's an alien vessel of some kind. And when the vessel is cracked open, Well, we end up with gooey alien cadavers like giant grasshoppers, and an amazingly apocalyptic little tale that derives some obvious influence from Invasion of the Body Snatchers and may itself have gone on to influence films like 28 Days Later. Mainly, I love the movie as an example of skillful, low-budget genre filmmaking from a period before the blockbuster mentality took over that's completely confident and sincere. These kinds of movies never gave the audience an ironic wink. They were unapologetically what they were. And they delivered tight, efficient, escapist storytelling that didn't waste anyone's time and wasn't afraid to be dark. Naturally, what passes for science in the story isn't going to pass muster with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and no, you're not going to get present-day levels of visual effects or technical wizardry, but you are going to get fun entertainment. And I'm glad a movie like this came along to teach me, as a budding young science fiction fan, that that's all the genre needs to strive for most of the time. The only problem is, if you want to see it, it may be difficult for a lot of you at the moment. There is a great restored Blu-ray available in the UK, but in the US, there was only a DVD that went out of print like 15 years ago, and as far as I know, nobody's streaming it. But for fans of Hammer movies, and movies like that from this period in genre cinema, it's absolutely worth hunting down.
Where am I? In the village. What do you want? Information.
Probably the holy grail of all retro cult television, The Prisoner was the brainchild of an actor named Patrick McGoohan, who was a huge star in his day, popular enough that he turned down the role of James Bond twice before it was given to Sean Connery, being a staunch Catholic. McGoohan disapproved of the character's womanizing. Patrick McGoohan rose to popularity in an earlier spy series from the early 60s that you've probably heard the theme song for.
Secret Asian man, secret Asian man.
After 4 seasons of that, McGoohan pitched the idea of a series about a secret agent who angrily retires from his profession for reasons he refuses to explain. He's quickly abducted and awakens in a strange village known only as The Village, where everyone goes by a number. Designated number 6, McGoohan's character spends much of the 17-episode run trying to escape the village and being thwarted at every turn by enigmatic bossman number 2. Number 2 is under orders by invisible higher-ups to break number 6's will and get him to confess why he resigned, which he simply will not do. Number 6 wants freedom and to discover the identity of number 1, who never appears. Now, in almost every episode, there is a different actor playing number 2, so I guess failure had some serious consequences. The general theme here was very much in the spirit of growing civil unrest in the late 1960s, the right of the individual to personal autonomy in an age of growing governmental incursions into privacy and personal freedoms. Now, there has always been a lot of fan speculation if number 6 was in fact John Drake, McGoohan's character from his earlier series. He always firmly denied this, but a lot of folks involved in The Prisoner's production considered it an expansion of the Danger Man universe, as it were. But whatever the case, the series created quite a stir at the time, mainly because no one had seen anything like it, and even a lot of the people who worked on it couldn't make heads or tails of it.
Bob Asher knocked on my dressing room door the first day, and he said, "Oh, hello," very quiet man. "Hello, Darren. We've never worked before, but this is interesting, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me something. I know I shouldn't say this as a director, but do you know what this is all about?" I said, "I have not the slightest idea. It is Chinese." He said, "Well, they've told me that I can now see the first episode, and that will explain everything. So look, have a cup of coffee. I'll see the first episode, then I'll come back and tell you what it's all about." So I had a cup of coffee. He came back and I said, "Well, Bob, what's it about?" He said, "I have no idea."
And the series finale? Wow. Okay, remember what I said about the pushback against 2001? That was nothing compared to the outraged reactions to the final episode of The Prisoner, in which not even a pretense of bringing everything to a logical conclusion is made, and instead the show tosses viewers head first into a bizarre, hallucinatory, allegorical courtroom sequence that single-handedly qualifies as the most batshit hour of television ever made. Viewers were so pissed off that McGoohan claimed he had to go into hiding. No, there was nothing quite like it, but The Prisoner undeniably influenced probably every attempt at puzzle box storytelling that has come along in the 50 years since. For years, there were plans for a remake or a reboot, and finally, in 2009, one appeared, a 6-episode miniseries starring Jim Caviezel as number 6, and Ian McKellen being awesomely Ian McKellen-ish as the sinister number 2. Now, despite being very earnest in honoring the spirit of the original while trying to modernize the story, the remake series didn't work for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that Jim Caviezel just lacks the commanding screen presence to make viewers invested in the plight of his number 6. But there's also the fact that what was revolutionary in 1967 simply wasn't in 2009, let alone 2018. For a remake of The Prisoner to work today, it would have to take into account the fact that we have been living in the world of compromised individuality the original series warned us about for decades now, and it's only getting creepier and scarier. And that subject has already been tackled by newer series like Black Mirror. It would take a science fiction writer of both great skill and highly specific sensibilities to reboot something like The Prisoner now. I'm thinking William Gibson or Cory Doctorow, maybe Annalee Newitz or Malka Older. But we don't need a reboot. We have the original as a kind of time capsule, a beacon from the past, here to remind us of what we need to hold on to in a world growing smaller and less secure every day. Today, if you're anywhere near northern Wales, you can visit the location where The Prisoner shot its exteriors, a curious resort called Portmeirion, where they do a brisk tourist trade. And yes, just like all the Harry Potter stuff that you can find at King's Cross Station, Portmeirion has a prisoner shop. And there we have it, gang! This was quite an adventure in production, but I enjoyed every minute of it. What are some of the SFF from other media that you have enjoyed? Please let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed watching, you know the drill. Hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. If you haven't done so, that is how SFF180 grows. You can also support the channel at my TeePublic store and at my Patreon, where recruits into Wink's Army get little perks like getting to see some of my videos early and things like that. I want to thank those people for their wonderful additional support. I want to thank you guys for being the best viewers on BookTube. And until I see you next time, be seeing you.